She is a woman of honest sort. She has an honest life and conversation. She is esteemed and reputed. She is minded and purposed to dwell elsewhere. Testimonials of Anne Rickard from the parishioners of St. James, Clerkenwell, London, 1620.
They have been described as coerced and kidnapped. They have been demeaned as women of low character and much worse. They have been snarkily referred to as mail-order brides. They have been positioned as exploited victims by writers claiming to defend them. And they have been grossly misrepresented. They are the 1619 to 1621 Virginia Brides. Even though the title of this series, Beyond Brideships, is taken from the walking tour, which seeks to go beyond the 1619 to 21 bride story, before we can go beyond, we should first examine the importance of the 1619 to 21 generation of so-called tobacco wives and how their experience was unique compared to English women who preceded them to Jamestown, as well as the vastly different treatment of non-English women. I also want to compare the Virginia Brides' experience to their sister story, the famous Filles du Roi, or the King's Daughters, who were sent to Quebec in the mid to late 17th century. Anytime I like to speak about Jamestown, I think it's important to always situate Virginia history into the larger world. First of all, the brides of 1619 to 21 were not the first women in Virginia. Although you will often hear this, it is incorrect and even insulting for two reasons. One, there were already thousands of women in Virginia, or Senecomica, before the English came in 1607. We even have archaeological evidence that Native American women lived at James Fort during its earliest years. Second, there were two English women at Jamestown by 1608. Nearly 20% of the population of the English colony in the 1619 to 10 starving time were female. There's plenty of material culture found that proves this, and it's also known that John Rolfe wrote of about 65, quote, women and children, unquote, in the colony in 1616. In other words, about 1/5 to 1/6 of the colony's population. The stories of these native and early English colonists will be covered in our next two videos.
So why then is the 1619 to 21 story a big deal? Well, as Rolfe's statement indicated, although women were present at Jamestown, there was a major gender imbalance. Despite Rolfe's own marriage to Pocahontas, English officials typically discouraged Englishmen from intermarrying with Powhatan women, although such unions were probably far more common than was admitted. This is in stark contrast to Portuguese and Spanish policy on the matter. Rolfe, as well as marrying Pocahontas, is famous for introducing a successful and profitable blend of tobacco in Virginia, a crop which went from 2,000 pounds to 60,000 pounds per year being shipped within only a decade. The big deal by 1619 is women were necessary for Jamestown to continue to profit. Whenever discussing Jamestown's first years, it is important to never forget that the Virginia colony was first and foremost a commercial enterprise. Jamestown was a company town, and the company everyone worked for was the Virginia Company of London. This company had been desperate to turn a profit from an enterprise that had provided mostly death, disease, starvation, political infighting, and conflict with the Virginia Indians. The company had turned to a lottery to lure investors. The company had turned to martial law to control the unruly settlers. The company had turned to censoring the mail to keep bad news from reaching England. But their gold had turned into nothing more than gilded dirt, literally and figuratively. It's tobacco that's the turning point. But raising tobacco required land and labor. It also required a stable political situation and effective government. Most of this would be addressed by the Virginia Company's new treasurer. This CFO came with new ideas. He was Sir Edwin Sandys, an intellectual, a reformer, and an unorthodox member of Parliament. On November 3, 1619, Sandys proposed to the Virginia Company that 100 marriageable maids be sent to Virginia. If the Jamestown planters had wives, Sands reasoned, they would later have children, and the colony would grow and prosper, and there would be financial and social inducements to keep these planters rooted in Virginia. In other words, happy planters would lead to a growth in the Virginia plantation, and thus a growth in the Virginia Company's profits. So what was the incentive for women to come to Virginia? First of all, there was an economic downturn in England. Second, women who were not from elite families often had to wait until they could afford marriage, what we would now call building up a nest egg. This often meant years of menial work as a servant for rich families. Third, those women who did finally marry would often have to travel several counties away to find a match, as often shows up in people's genealogical records. And fourth, historians often deny the agency of women to improve their lives and seek their own fortunes elsewhere, something that isn't questioned, for example, in the first male colonists at Jamestown in 1607. So what was the Virginia Company offering these women? The company was offering women who were, quote, young, handsome, and honestly educated, unquote, who could provide evidence of good character, free passage to Virginia. Now, this was no small feat considering the enormous cost of transport and the poor financial profits of the company itself. So it's the company investing a lot in these women, who clearly were seen as essential to the well-being of the entire enterprise. The company also provided beds and bedding, gloves and clothing to the women who came to Virginia. Most importantly, the Virginia Company offered the women a plot of land. This was a major relaxation of the English laws of coverture, and meant these brides would be more independent and uncommonly provided for compared to life in England. So what was the catch? Well, the women had to provide evidence of their good character. This has led to an abundance of testimonials in the records of church wardens, priests, parents, siblings, and neighbors describing the character of these prospective brides. Almost like a job interview or college application, the potential colonists testified to their job skills, such as spinning, sewing, baking, brewing, and even in a couple cases, skills such as working silk and gold and silver. Most were never married, but a few were widows. Most were from poor and middling families, but there were a smattering of women who were high-born. What is clear is that they were willing to come, at least partially understood the risks, and made connections in order to secure a spot and make their fortune in Virginia. This is in stark contrast to the type of women being transported just a few years earlier to Virginia. From 1615 to 1618, when Virginia's reputation was still poor, many convicts were transported to the colony from the infamous Bridewell Court of London. Among these were so-called vagrant women and those picked up for petty crimes. More common, though, were colonists, male and female, exploited because of their poverty. Some English colonists were actually transported against their will. There was a man named Owen Evans who was convicted in 1618 of kidnapping English women in Somerset County, England. The women were rescued before they departed, and Owen Evans was caught and drawn and quartered. But he was executed not for kidnapping the women, but for illegally using the king's own seal. So Treasurer Sands, in his thinking, was wise to avoid populating the new phase of the Jamestown colony with unwilling women, at least in the case of English women. While this sounds like a relatively decent situation for those selected Jamestown brides, there still is the unpleasant situation of brides being auctioned for tobacco. What was this really about? Well, potential suitors had to pay the Virginia Company the weight of 150 pounds of tobacco. By 1620, this amount of tobacco sold for 18 pounds sterling in England. 12 pounds sterling of this covered the price of transporting, feeding, and clothing the women, and 6 pounds sterling went as profit to the Virginia Company. So here we see another strength of Sands' plan over forced transport. It's profitable. But it was also important to remember that these brides were not pressured to marry against their will. They had a choice of suitors. The 150 pounds the potential husband had to pay, it meant only economically stable men could apply. Therefore, many women moved up socially by marrying such men. This policy left many poor men out. Nevertheless, the brides could feel more financially secure in this arrangement and could set up a household and prosper much more quickly than back home in England. So did it work? Between 1619 to 1621, about 147 women became tobacco brides during this time period of the policy of the Virginia Company. That number reflects only those women who survived the journey across the Atlantic, which was far from guaranteed. In 1622, however, a Powhatan uprising disrupted the Virginia Company's plans. Pent-up anger over English aggression exploded, leading to the deaths of 1/4 to 1/3 of the English colonists on a single day. Among them were some of these Jamestown tobacco brides. The English would counterattack, and war and destruction once again returned to the Virginia colony.
Nevertheless, for some of these women, those who survived transport and war and disease, things that wiped out about 80% of all English colonists within their first few years, these women often prospered. In Virginia, these English women found economic and political independence that they would not have found at home. These English women.
So are there parallels to the Jamestown tobacco brides? Well, the most notable to me is the similarity with the Filles du Roi, or Daughters of the King, who left France for Canada between 1663 and 1673. Over 800 women were actively recruited by the French government as brides for the French colonists. The initial waves of French colonists in the early 17th century were overwhelmingly male, but it'd be hard-pressed to call them waves, as in the early days of the French settlements in Canada, the settlers relied on a fur trade with the First Nations communities. Many Frenchmen intermarried with local women, which was hardly noticed back home. By the mid-17th century, French colonization had expanded, which threatened the Five Nations or Iroquois. As the French government began to war with the Iroquois, many soldiers were recruited and sent to Canada. Not all of these soldiers were French, and even among the French, not all were Catholic. The French government needed soldiers, needed bodies really, so asking questions regarding religion or ethnicity was not a priority. What was a priority was to keep an armed male population in ready hand in America, one that would at least be loyal to the colony, if not necessarily France itself. Therefore, the French crown actively began recruiting women as brides for these soldiers. Similar to Jamestown, the women were young and single, and the church sought testimonials from parish priests to attest to the women's character. Also like Jamestown, these brides were provided free transportation and supplies, as well as protection from the church and a right of refusal to marry any man that would inquire of them. When the brides arrived, they were sailed down the St. Lawrence River to the settlements of Trois-Rivières, Quebec City, and Montreal. Most were married within a year. But like Jamestown, the character of these women was assailed by later historians, and in the case of Quebec, even during the 17th century. Yet of the 800 women sent to Canada, only one was ever charged with prostitution. Were the Filles du Roi different? Perhaps one reason is the nature of religious enticement. Although they were recruited out of Paris and were nominally supposed to be Catholic, many of these French brides actually originated from Rochelle and Normandy, areas of France known for the Huguenot Calvinist Protestant movement, which is being persecuted by King Louis XIV. So the king found a way to solve his Huguenot problem by transporting Protestant women disproportionately to the New World. But consider this, many of the soldiers came from these same regions, and we know a lot of the parish priests in Canada were complaining about the Huguenot heresies that were left unchecked in Canada. But in many ways, this didn't matter. France needed soldiers, France needed settlers, France needed wives, and France needed children. Therefore, many of these 800 Filles du Roi became the ancestors of almost all French Canadians today. These Filles du Roi, no matter their origins, are hugely important, just like the Jamestown Brides, because they use their own agency to better their lives in the New World. And they are the founding mothers of all French Canadians and their descendants all over the world, including me. And to them I say, merci.